My husband's hand lingered on her waist as he smiled at the circle of executives gathered near the bar. His expression warm and confident. "This is my colleague Vanessa Torres," he said effortlessly, his voice carrying that professional charm he'd perfected over years of networking. "She's been instrumental in the Henderson account." The word colleague landed like an insult, sharp and precise, cutting through the pleasant hum of conversation around us. She leaned into him slightly, her body language comfortable and practiced, like they'd stood this way 100 times before. Her smile was polished and appropriate, her dark hair swept up in an elegant style, her navy dress professional but flattering. They looked like a unit, pair. While I stood 3 feet away holding a champagne glass so tightly my knuckles had gone pale, invisible in my own marriage. The circle of executives nodded approvingly, making polite sounds about teamwork and successful partnerships. No one looked at me for confirmation. No one asked who I was or how I fit into this picture. I might as well have been part of the decor. The laughter around us continued, light and easy, as someone asked a question about quarterly projections. My husband answered smoothly, still standing close to Vanessa, his hand finally dropping from her waist but his body angled toward hers rather than mine. My chest burned with something I couldn't quite name yet, anger or humiliation or shock, my body reacting faster than my mind could catch up. I forced a polite smile, the expression feeling stretched and false on my face, my jaw aching with the effort of maintaining it. Someone refilled my champagne glass and I thanked them automatically, the social training of 6 years as a corporate wife kicking in even as my world tilted sideways. The venue was beautiful, all soft lighting and expensive floral arrangements, the kind of event space that hosted only the most important gatherings. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Everything was perfect and polished and carefully orchestrated, including, apparently, my husband's introduction of his girlfriend to his professional circle while his actual wife stood there watching. Vanessa glanced at me then, just once, her eyes meeting mine over the rim of her wine glass. Not curious about who I was. Not confused about the situation or uncomfortable with the dynamic. Just measuring, assessing. Her gaze was cool and calculating, taking in my dress and jewelry and position in the circle, categorizing me in some internal hierarchy I apparently ranked low in. There was knowledge in that look, certainty and confidence that told me she knew exactly who I was. She wasn't surprised to see me. Wasn't worried about being caught or exposed. She was comfortable in her role here, whatever that role was, more comfortable than I felt in mine. And in that look, something inside me snapped into focus. This wasn't a casual flirtation or inappropriate office friendship. This was established, ongoing, acknowledged between them even if it wasn't acknowledged to anyone else. The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. The late nights, the business trips, the networking events I'd been told weren't spouse appropriate. All of it had been creating space for this, for her, for whatever relationship they'd built while I'd stayed home being the supportive wife. My name is Carissa Vaughn. I'm 34 years old, a white American woman who'd spent the last 6 years believing I knew exactly who I was standing beside. I'd married my husband Troy when I was 28, fresh from business school myself, ready to build a life with someone I thought shared my values and vision. He'd been ambitious and driven, working his way up through a commercial real estate development firm with single-minded focus. I'd supported that ambition completely. I'd been the perfect corporate wife, attending events and hosting dinners and networking alongside him, building relationships that advanced his career. I'd put my own ambitions on hold, my own MBA gathering dust while I managed our home and social calendar and everything else that went into maintaining the appearance of success. Until this moment, standing in this elegant venue watching my husband introduce another woman with casual intimacy, I believed our partnership was real, that my sacrifices mattered, that I was building something worthwhile. The realization that I'd been building alone was devastating in its completeness. I'd supported Troy's career relentlessly for 6 years. Late nights when he worked on proposals and I brought him dinner at the office. Cancelled plans when client emergencies came up and he needed to be available. Endless networking events where I smiled on cue and asked the right questions and remembered everyone's names and their spouses' names and their children's activities. I've been good at it, actually. Good at reading a room and making connections and presenting the image of stability and partnership that corporate culture valued. This night was supposed to be another one of those events. Troy had mentioned it casually 3 weeks ago over breakfast. Annual client appreciation dinner, he'd said. Spouses invited this year since they'd upgraded to a bigger venue. I should wear something elegant but not flashy, he'd suggested. Something that said successful but approachable. I'd chosen a burgundy dress that cost more than I usually spent on clothes, had my hair done professionally, worn the diamond earrings Troy had given me for our 5th anniversary. And I'd watched him introduce another woman to colleagues who should have been introduced to me. The effort suddenly felt pathetic. The venue glowed with quiet luxury, every detail carefully chosen to impress without overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers hung from exposed wooden beams, creating a blend of rustic and refined that was very on-brand for Troy's firm. Round tables draped in cream linens were scattered throughout the space, each centerpiece a low arrangement of white roses and eucalyptus. A bar stretched along one wall, staffed by servers in black vests who poured top-shelf liquor with practiced efficiency. This wasn't a casual gathering thrown together at the last minute. This was curated, intentional, exclusive. The kind of event where guest lists were reviewed by multiple people, where seating charts were strategic, where nothing happened accidentally. Which meant every person here had been vetted and approved. Including Vanessa. She hadn't crashed this event or shown up unexpectedly. She'd been invited. Her name had been on some lists submitted by someone approved by the planning committee. And Troy had known she'd be here, had probably helped coordinate her attendance, had certainly not mentioned to me that his colleague would be present. Vanessa touched Troy's arm when she laughed at something one of the executives said. Her fingers light against his jacket sleeve. He didn't move away. Didn't step back or create distance or acknowledge the touch was inappropriate. He just smiled and continued the conversation, completely comfortable with her casual intimacy. No colleague would touch their coworker that way at a professional event. No husband should allow it, not with his wife standing right there. But Troy seemed oblivious or unconcerned. His body language open and relaxed in a way I hadn't seen him be. Around me in months. When had we last stood this close at an event? When had he last looked at me the way he was looking at her now, engaged and interested and present? I couldn't remember. The realization made my stomach turn. I'd been so focused on supporting his career, on being useful and helpful and appropriate, that I hadn't noticed when he'd stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as furniture. Functional but unremarkable. There when needed but easily ignored when something more interesting appeared. When dinner was announced and people started moving toward their tables, I looked for my place card among the elegant name cards arranged on a display near the entrance. The seating chart was alphabetical by last name, organized on a white board with gold lettering. I found Vaughn easily enough. But when I looked at the actual place card, confusion flickered through me before understanding hit. My name was listed alone. Carissa Vaughn. Table 7, Seat 3. A single name on the card, no indication of a +1 or spouse pairing. I turned back to the seating chart, following the list more carefully now. Troy's name was there under V as well. Troy Vaughn. But his table assignment was different. Table 4, Seat 8. And listed beside his name, sharing his place card in the way that indicated a pair, was Vanessa Torres. They were seated together. Deliberately. Officially. While I'd been placed alone at a different table, surrounded by people I'd never met. I stared at the cards long enough to memorize every detail. The font. The placement. The lie made visible in gold script on cream cardstock. I didn't confront Troy about the seating arrangement. I didn't pull him aside or make a scene or demand explanations in front of his colleagues. I didn't cry or let my composure crack or give anyone reason to notice something was wrong. I simply walked to table 7 and sat down in my assigned seat, my movements calm and controlled despite the rage building in my chest. The champagne glass went on the table. My clutch purse settled in my lap. I smiled at the strangers around me and introduced myself when they asked, playing the role I'd perfected over 6 years. Gracious, interested, appropriate. While inside something cold and calculating was taking shape. Anger without clarity only helps the liar, only gives them ammunition to claim you're overreacting or being emotional or not understanding the situation correctly. I needed clarity before I needed confrontation. I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening before I revealed that I knew anything was wrong. So I sat at table 7 with strangers and observed, watching Troy and Vanessa at table 4, documenting every interaction with clinical precision. As the evening unfolded through appetizers and salad courses and the main entree, their familiarity surfaced in fragments that would have been easy to miss individually but together painted a complete picture. Shared jokes that made them both laugh while the rest of the table smiled politely, clearly not understanding the reference. Subtle glances exchanged during speeches, private communications happening in public space. Synchronized movements when they both reached for wine glasses or turned to comment on something the speaker said. The comfort of people who'd spent significant time together, who knew each other's rhythms and reactions and thoughts. This wasn't new. This wasn't a recent development or a conference fling that had gotten complicated. This was rehearsed and established and running alongside my marriage like a parallel track I'd been too trusting to notice. I watched them through 3 courses and coffee service, taking mental notes of every touch and look and laugh, building a case in my mind that facts would support. Because I was done being the oblivious wife. Done making excuses for late nights and cancelled plans and distance I'd attributed to work stress. Done trusting when my instincts had been screaming for months that something was wrong. During dessert, I approached the event coordinator who was stationed near the entrance monitoring the flow of service. She was a professional woman in her 40s with an efficient manner and a tablet she consulted constantly. I'd met her briefly when Troy and I had arrived, exchanging pleasantries about the venue and the turnout. Now I smiled warmly and asked if I could get a copy of the guest list for networking follow-up purposes. My husband mentioned several clients I should connect with, I explained smoothly, but I didn't catch all their names during introductions. I thought having the list with company affiliations would help me send appropriate follow-up notes. She didn't hesitate. Of course, that's very thoughtful. Let me email it to you right now. What address should I use? I gave her my personal email, the one Troy didn't have access to, and watched her type quickly on her tablet. There you go, she said, looking up with a professional smile. It includes names, titles, and company affiliations. Should have everything you need. I thanked her and returned to my table, my phone already buzzing with the notification. I opened the email slowly, deliberately, taking a breath before clicking on the attachment. The guest list loaded on my phone screen in a neat spreadsheet format. Names in alphabetical order, companies in the next column, titles and departments after that. I scrolled slowly, my finger moving down the screen while dessert plates were cleared around me. The list was thorough, exactly what the coordinator had promised. Every person in attendance documented with their professional affiliations. I found Vanessa's name halfway down. Vanessa Torres. The company column listed Meridian Solutions, a marketing firm I'd never heard Troy mention. The title column said Senior Marketing Director. The department column was blank. I sat back slightly, reading the entry 3 more times. Then I pulled up Troy's firm website on my phone, navigating to the Henderson account page he'd mentioned when introducing Vanessa. The account team was listed there, photos and brief bios of everyone working on the project. I scrolled through 12 people. Vanessa Torres wasn't among them. I checked the broader company directory. No Vanessa Torres employed by Troy's firm in any capacity. The lie wasn't just emotional anymore. It wasn't subjective or open to interpretation. It was documented, verifiable, concrete. She wasn't his colleague. She'd never worked on the Henderson account. Everything he'd said tonight was false, and I had proof. Memory shifted and reorganized around this new information like a kaleidoscope clicking into a different pattern. Suddenly every late night over the past year clicked into place with horrible clarity. The Henderson account had launched 14 months ago, right around the time Troy had started staying at the office until 9 or 10 several nights a week. He'd said the client was demanding, that the project timeline was aggressive, that he needed to be available for late meetings and strategy sessions. I'd believed him completely. Had never questioned why he couldn't work from home sometimes or why these late nights always seemed to fall on the same days of the week. Thursdays. Almost always Thursdays. Every unexplained absence gained shape and substance now. The weekend conference in Austin he'd attended alone, claiming spouse attendance would be awkward. The 3-day training in Chicago I hadn't been invited to. The client dinner last month where he'd said significant others would make the conversation too casual. All of it had been creating opportunities to be with her. This affair had been hiding behind professionalism, behind the demanding nature of his career that I'd been trained not to question or resent. Using my own support as cover, I stopped asking questions at home after that night. Stopped filling the quiet spaces in our house with effort and conversation and attempts to connect. When Troy came home late on Thursday nights, I didn't ask about his day or whether he'd eaten or how the Henderson account was progressing. I just greeted him neutrally and returned to whatever I'd been doing. When he mentioned upcoming business trips or evening obligations, I didn't offer to adjust my schedule or ask if he needed anything or suggest we find time to reconnect afterward. I simply acknowledged the information and moved on. The silence in our house grew heavier, more noticeable, but Troy didn't seem to register it as concerning. He mistook my calm for ignorance, my quiet for acceptance. Thought I was just being the low-maintenance wife he'd always appreciated, not demanding attention or emotional labor or explanations. He had no idea I'd stopped asking questions because I was finding answers elsewhere. That I was documenting and observing and building a case that would make questions unnecessary. The silence wasn't peace. It was strategy. And he was too comfortable in his deception to recognize the difference. 3 weeks after the client appreciation dinner, Troy's firm hosted another event. A ribbon cutting for a new development project downtown, less formal than the dinner but still professional and public. Spouses were invited again, a detail Troy mentioned casually over breakfast the morning of. I agreed to attend, chose a simple dress and minimal jewelry, showed up at the construction site where a small crowd had gathered around a blue ribbon stretched across the building entrance. Vanessa was there too, standing near the front with a cluster of people I recognized from Troy's firm. When the speeches began and someone asked Troy to introduce his team members for the assembled crowd, he gestured to the group including Vanessa. "This is our development coordination team," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the space. "They've been instrumental in bringing this project to completion." Different words than he'd used 3 weeks ago. Different title. Different context. People noticed. I saw heads turn slightly, executives exchanging glances. Inconsistencies don't stay private in professional circles where people pay attention to details and remember previous introductions. Troy's story about Vanessa's role was changing, and the changes were creating questions. Conversations shifted subtly when Troy and Vanessa passed together at networking events over the following weeks. I attended 3 more gatherings, playing my role as the supportive spouse, and watched the social dynamics change. Voices lowered when they approached. Smiles became more careful, more measured. People who'd been warm and engaging at the client dinner now seemed reserved, their body language slightly closed. Invitations changed too. Troy mentioned being excluded from a golf outing he'd usually be included in. A lunch meeting he'd expected to be invited to happened without him. Small social signals that his standing was shifting, that people were reassessing their relationship with him. The professional community he'd worked so hard to cultivate was beginning to turn, not dramatically or overtly, but in the quiet ways that mattered in corporate culture. Reputation was everything in his industry. Trust was currency. And both were eroding because he'd been careless about his lies, confident that no one would notice or care about inconsistencies in how he presented his relationship with Vanessa. The room had begun to turn against him, and he seemed oblivious to it. An internal review was triggered at Troy's firm in early December, about 6 weeks after the client appreciation dinner. I know because Troy came home one evening agitated and stressed in ways I hadn't seen before, pacing our living room and talking rapidly about bureaucratic nonsense and administrative overreach. "They're reviewing the Henderson account team structure," he said, running his hands through his hair. "Questioning why certain contractors were brought in, what their qualifications were, whether proper vetting procedures were followed. It's ridiculous. Everything was done by the book." I listened without commenting, letting him vent while I poured wine. "They're probably just covering their bases," I offered neutrally. "Making sure everything's documented properly." He nodded, wanting to believe that explanation. But I suspected the review had been triggered by the inconsistencies in his introductions of Vanessa, by questions about her actual role versus her claimed role, by mismatched credentials and misrepresentation that someone had finally decided to investigate formally. I hadn't filed any complaints or reached out to anyone at his firm. I'd simply stepped back and let the natural consequences unfold. Let the lies collapse under their own weight without my interference. Vanessa grew visibly distant from Troy over the next few weeks. I noticed because I was watching, paying attention to every interaction at the holiday party his firm hosted in mid-December. She arrived alone and stayed on the opposite side of the room from him most of the evening. When they did interact, her body language was closed and formal, none of the casual intimacy from the client dinner. She left early without saying goodbye to him, and I saw his eyes follow her to the door with an expression I'd never seen before. Confusion. Fantasy collapses when accountability enters the room, when the secret relationship that felt exciting and transgressive becomes complicated by scrutiny and questions. When the woman you've been seeing realizes she's been lied to about your marriage status, or your professional standing, or your ability to protect her reputation. Vanessa had clearly done the math and decided the equation no longer worked in her favor. The risk had become too high, the benefit too uncertain. So she'd stepped back, protecting herself the way Troy had never protected me. I felt no sympathy for either of them. Just cold satisfaction that the careful lies were unraveling exactly as they deserved to. Troy tried to reassure me through December and into January that everything was fine. Work was just stressful, he said. The internal review was routine and would be over soon. The Henderson account was wrapping up successfully despite some administrative headaches. His tone was confident, but underneath I could hear uncertainty, anxiety he was trying to hide. I nodded along with his explanations, making appropriate concerned sounds, offering generic support. While inside I was already emotionally gone. I'd spent 3 months since the client dinner documenting and observing and protecting myself. I'd consulted with a divorce attorney, a sharp woman named Victoria who specialized in high-asset separations. I'd opened separate bank accounts and started moving my personal funds out of our joint finances. Collected evidence of the affair, screenshots and photos, and the guest list that proved Vanessa wasn't his colleague. I'd prepared systematically for the end of my marriage, while Troy had been trying to hold together his affair and his reputation and his lies. He thought my calm meant everything was fine between us. That I was still the supportive wife who didn't ask difficult questions. He had no idea I was just waiting for the right moment to leave. Professional opportunities vanished quietly for Troy through the winter. The promotion to senior partner he'd been expecting was delayed indefinitely with vague explanations about organizational restructuring. Projects were reassigned to other team leaders. Important accounts moved to colleagues who'd been his juniors months before. Client relationships that had been his were transferred without explanation or apology. Troy grew increasingly frustrated and confused, unable to understand why his career trajectory had suddenly stalled. He complained about office politics and unfair treatment, about people undermining him for unclear reasons. I listened with detached sympathy, offering none of the usual reassurance or advice. Trust had been revoked without official explanation. His standing in the firm quietly diminished because people had lost confidence in his judgment and integrity. The lies about Vanessa had rippled outward, creating doubt about what else he might be lying about, what other shortcuts he might be taking, what other rules he might be breaking. Arrogance had made him careless. He'd believed his performance would outweigh any personal indiscretions, that professional results would protect him from consequences. He'd been wrong. And now he was losing everything he'd sacrificed our marriage to build. Vanessa left the city entirely in February. I found out through social media, one of those vague posts about new opportunities and fresh starts that people make when they're running from something. Troy didn't mention it, but I saw the change in him. The distraction that became permanent. The way he stared at his phone like he was waiting for messages that never came. The deflation in his posture that suggested loss. She'd left without drama. No scene or confrontation or public goodbye. Just quietly exited from whatever mess they'd created together, protecting her own career and reputation by putting distance between herself and the situation. She'd mistaken secrecy for stability. Had probably believed Troy's promises about leaving his wife or building a future together or whatever fantasy he'd sold her. When reality had shown up in the form of professional scrutiny and reputation risk, she'd made the logical choice to walk away. Troy was left holding the consequences alone. The affair that had seemed worth risking everything for had evaporated, leaving him with a failing career, a damaged reputation, and a marriage he didn't know was already over. I told Troy I knew about Vanessa on a Saturday morning in March. We were in the kitchen, the early sunlight streaming through windows I'd been planning to replace with something more modern. He was reading something on his tablet, coffee going cold beside him, completely unaware of what was coming. "We need to talk," I said quietly, and something in my tone made him look up. I sat down across from him at the table and spoke calmly, without emotion or accusation, just fact by fact. The client dinner where he'd introduced her as a colleague. The guest list that proved she'd never worked for his firm. The seating arrangement that had paired them together. The subsequent events where his story about her role kept changing. The evidence I'd gathered over 4 months of watching and documenting. Troy's face went through a progression of expressions. Confusion. Denial. Panic. He tried to interrupt several times to explain or minimize or reframe, but I kept talking. Kept laying out the timeline and the lies and the proof. When I finally stopped, the silence was complete. He had no defense left. No story that would hold up against documentation. No way to deny what I'd observed and verified. I filed for divorce the following Monday with complete clarity and no hesitation. Victoria had prepared everything over the past months, so it was just a matter of signing papers and authorizing her to proceed. The filing was clean and straightforward. No fault dissolution, equitable division of assets, no children to complicate custody arrangements. I documented the affair thoroughly in case Troy tried to contest anything, but Victoria thought he'd settle quickly once he understood the extent of evidence we had. "Men like him usually do," she'd said during our last meeting. "They want to minimize exposure, keep things quiet, protect what's left of their reputation." I moved out that same week into an apartment I'd secured the month before, a one-bedroom with large windows and hardwood floors that felt nothing like the house Troy and I had shared. I took only what was mine, leaving behind the furniture we'd chosen together, and the wedding photos and the careful construct of our life. I reclaimed my space and my routines and my future piece by piece. Peace replaced the constant vigilance I'd been living with. Relief replaced anger. Forward momentum replaced stagnation. The divorce was finalized in August, 5 months after I'd confronted Troy in our kitchen. He'd settled without contesting anything, signing papers quickly through his attorney with minimal communication. We'd met once at Victoria's office to handle final documentation, sitting across from each other in formal conference chairs while lawyers reviewed terms. Troy had looked diminished somehow, smaller than I remembered. His confidence had eroded over the months of professional consequences and personal failure. He'd tried to speak to me as we were leaving, had started to say something that might have been an apology or explanation. I'd cut him off with a raised hand. "There's nothing left to say," and walked out without looking back. I'd rebuilt my life entirely by then. Reconnected with friends I'd neglected during my marriage. Pursued career opportunities I'd put on hold to support Troy. Traveled alone to places I'd always wanted to see. Rediscovered who I was outside of being someone's wife, someone's support system, someone's convenient cover. The woman I'd become was stronger and clearer than the woman who'd stood at that client dinner watching her husband introduce his girlfriend. That version of me had been too willing to ignore instincts and accept lies. The current version trusted herself completely. Troy lost access to my life completely after the divorce was finalized. I blocked his number and his email, unfriended him on every social media platform, made it clear through Victoria that all future communication should go through attorneys only. He tried to reach out a few times in the beginning, messages forwarded by Victoria asking if we could talk, if there was any possibility of reconciliation or at least closure. I declined every request. I didn't need closure from him anymore. Didn't need explanations or apologies or understanding. I'd found my own closure through the process of documenting his lies, protecting myself legally and financially, and walking away with my dignity intact. A year after the client dinner, I attended a networking event for my own career and ran into someone who'd been at that original gathering. She recognized me immediately. "I'm glad you're doing well," she said quietly, and I understood she'd known even then what was happening. Had seen the dynamic between Troy and Vanessa and felt sympathy I hadn't wanted. "I am," I replied honestly. "Better than I've been in years." And it was true. Walking away from Troy hadn't been weakness or failure or giving up. It had been the moment I'd finally chosen myself over someone who'd never valued what I'd offered. That choice had saved me.